Hello, everybody, and welcome to another installment of Summer of NativeScript. My name is Clark, and with me I have TJ. TJ, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It is a nice summer day here in Chicago. How about over there in Michigan?
It's been raining all day, so
That's good. You keep it on that east side of us, so
yeah.
I don't want any of that stuff. So, second installment. We're in the middle of summer. Let's. What did we do the first time? Just to recap for people who haven't, who might just be starting with us now.
Yep. So if you missed the first segment, we basically set the stage for NativeScript, what NativeScript is, just some of the real basic stuff, how it works, how to scaffold up a basic app. We built a little app that was basically Hello World, showed an image in it, but that was about it. So you can go back and watch that video at nativescript.org/summer if you want to check that out. But we really didn't go to segue here beyond the basics.
There you go. That very professional segue there. Yeah. So today, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about navigation. We're going to talk about eventing. We're going to go through some layout, some modules, widgets, controls. We're going to touch on some data binding and end with CSS. So we're going to be all front-end native scripters, if that's a term. Can that be a term?
Front-end nativers, yeah.
Nativers. So layout stuff. And like last time, we're just going to have a conversation about things. We're going to go through some slides. We're going to show some code. And we'll qualify all this with it works on our devices. So
it's true.
Tomorrow, it may not, but today it does. So, a few months ago, you and I were at a conference called Telerik Next, and we did a workshop on NativeScript, and we spent 8 hours trying to explain to a room full of people what NativeScript is and how to build something. And to do so, we built an app called Just Meme, and it's an app that builds memes, right? Take a picture of something, annotate it, share it, have a little fun. And the whole point was to teach something that was real. It was in a store. It had real world things. We had real world problems. It talks to real servers, right? There's no hello world stuff here. So we're going to use this kind of for our backdrop today, talk about how this was structured such that we have something concrete to talk to. And then the labs are going to build this, right?
Yep. Yeah. So if you go through the labs associated with this month of the Summer of NativeScript, you'll build some of the components that we're talking about today. So you'll get your hands dirty, if you will.
I like the hands dirty. All right. So let's just dive right in. So this is kind of the basic app. Now we're gonna kind of just talk about the first screen, but in the context of Just Meme, here are the three things. There's a scroll view of images of varying sizes, if you will. You click on an image, you get to create a new meme. And then in that new meme, you get to add the annotations which go on a picture, and then you get to share it. You also can create a template. So here we're using the camera to take a picture or import a picture from your camera roll, and then add it to your list of memes that you can then later annotate. So overall, not a very complex thing, from an application perspective, but it certainly exercises a great deal of the platform.
Yep. It's pretty much purposely simple to show some of the concepts that we'll be talking about today.
Yeah. So if we dive into that a little bit and we talk about the app, you can see if we click on a picture, we get taken to another screen depending on what it's at. If you click on the action item in the menu bar, we get taken to another view. And then this happens to be wrapped up in a tab view. So we have a list of our templates or our pictures, and then or a list of all the pictures and then a list of our pictures. And then a tab view kind of floats back and forth between the two of them. So nothing too complicated, right?
Yep.
Not yet.
Not yet. Pretty simple.
So let's look at that first screen, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how we compose this. But the first screen is actually brought up of three separate groups of pictures. So the top set of pictures are images that we baked into the application that gets shipped to the store. So I don't know, it's 9, 10 images, right? They're in the app package.
Yep.
After that, we have images that you've taken and saved locally. So these are your fun pictures. They're sitting in local storage on your device, or on your device in your app. In your app on your device? Whatever, something like that. But it's in your app's local storage. And then that third section are images that we've pulled from, in our case, Teller backend services, and then off the CDN. So we're loading those dynamically, because part of this was kind of social sharing for us, right? We've added this ability for people to upload pictures and then share them with their friends that they can annotate to.
Yeah, and I think these are all, to go back to the previous point, these are all sort of real world things that you might need to do in your app. I mean, certain times that you may have resources that you need to be actually a part of your app for, say, offline usage and such. Sometimes you need to save locally to the device's memory, and sometimes you need the data to actually live in the cloud. So the idea behind this is just to show all of them in action, and so show also kind of how they can coexist as well.
Yeah, and speaking of real world, here's a layout that's got some images that are added dynamically. We don't know these ahead of time. We don't know the sizes ahead of time. They're coming from somewhere else, so we don't necessarily know what if there's thousands of pictures. We can't block the UI thread from doing that. So there's a lot going on to try to build this list and be useful, if you will.
Yep.
All right, so let's kind of dive through and we talked about how the pictures are structured. Let's dive what's going on this page. So first, obviously, we load the page. Now, you could argue about what are the different ways to compose this page, but in this case, this is what we're doing. We're loading the page. We're cleaning up any past elements. We're reading local storage or local storage locations. Whatever we find, we're going to loop on it. Once we start looping on it, we're going to create an image element. We're going to assign a gesture to that element because it has no kind of inherent properties other than it's an image, right? When we want to be able to tap on an image. Once you tap on it, which is the gesture, you're going to want to call a callback so that you can do what you want to do. And then we're going to want to add that stuff to the layout and then let the layout subsystem do what it needs to do. It seem acceptable?
Yep. Yeah. Why don't we start to dig into some of these?
All right. So when we tap on an image, what we wanted to do was pass the image to the next screen. So kind of foreshadowing into that navigation, but that callback is going to take a reference to that image and then pass it along. So navigation, right? Kind of the center of our thing. We want to move around our application. And what does it really mean, right? At least for me, and I think you'd agree with this, right? It's how do I get from here to there? How do I pass something? What events happen? And then how do I get back? Right?
Yep. Yeah, and these are similar concepts to the web, really any sort of application development. You need to go from one view or page to another.
Yep. From here to there. And how do I know what happened over there when I was here?
Yep.
So simply put, this is how you do navigation, right? We're going to get the frame that we're in. We're going to set some context, and then we're going to navigate to that thing. So here you see below, we're going to get the frame module. Now we'll talk more in detail about modules, but hang with me for a second. We're going to load that UI frame module. We're going to get its topmost container, if you will. We're going to call navigate, and then in navigate, we're going to pass it some properties or some arguments. So in this case, the module name, this is the relative path to where we want to go. We're going to pass along the context. As we said earlier, that's going to be the image. And then if we want any kind of UI animation along the way. So pretty simple, right? I mean, there's not really much here other than you could add some abstractions over the top of it to make it easier, but in the simple sense that this is what you need to do.
Yeah, and there's an alternate signature that's even simpler. If you don't have any context, like sometimes you just need a simple link. You can just pass the module name as a string in there directly,
So
which is
to navigate.
yep to navigate. So it'd be navigate open parenthesis and then the components create meme portion, and
Nice.
that'll just act more or less like a link.
Ah, very nice. Learn something every day. So then if I want to go back, right, because in the navigation, we have a navigation stack, and that's all kind of maintained and managed for us without us knowing about it. Again, I grab that topmost frame and I just call go back, and it's going to take me back up the stack. You got a shorthand syntax for that too?
No, although you did, you might have missed a space there. I don't know if that's just the slide deck, but it looks like you put a space between topmost and go back there.
I'm going to claim fault on Google Sheets.
Yeah.
And on to the next slide. There we go. I didn't even see any spaces there. So one of the things that we wanted to do along the way as we're starting to crawl into the weeds is just save off some references. So like the other things, this will be out there and available. Here's some links to navigation, some links to the code inside of JustMeme and whatnot. So that's there for people to reference. All right, let's talk about events. And like any good event, sometimes you hit the wall when they don't start working. So I like to think of this, at least for me, I think that there are two levels of events: application level events and view level events. And I don't know if that's just how you and I talk about them or if that's a legit thing.
Yeah, I think it helps to separate different things that we're talking about here, because they're both events, but they're different concepts within your app.
Yeah. So application level events are things that happen at the app level, and somewhat obvious, right? But they happen, in the front or back of something, front and back of the app, if you will. And then the view level events fire when a page is brought in and out of focus or navigated to.
Yep. Yeah, I almost like to think of it. I mean, an application will contain one-to-many views. So the application are things that are happening more on a global level, whereas the view are things that are happening at that sort of sub-level when you're actually interacting or doing something with the view.
Sure. Now, these not to be confused with events that happen on controls. There is a whole nother eventing stack that happens for controls. We're just separating out the app and the view here.
Yeah, and controls would be things like your text field or button. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, so let's look at some. So from an application perspective, on launch, on resume, suspend, exit, uncaught error, and low memory. So those are certainly not in the order of execution, but there for you to use and do creative things with. And after we get through this section, let's dump into a little code because I'm getting tired of slides.
Yep.
To wire these things up, really, if you've written JavaScript, this isn't going to be anything special. But here we're in app.js, so our main app container, or our kickoff point, if you will. We're going to grab the application module, and then from there, we're going to just set some functions. So application on exit, we're going to have a call a function, and in this case, we're stopping some analytics from happening. So once our app's done, stop our monitor and let us know that the session's over. Is there anything that you think that you wouldn't want to do in an app level event?
Yeah, I think you wouldn't want to do anything too crazy. I think analytics here is actually a good usage, because I think the idea here would be maybe for whatever reason you need to track how long people are using your app. So you'd start when the app starts, stop when it stops it. You could also use resume and suspend for that same sort of thing, sort of stop some timer or stop it there.
Yeah.
I think you'd want to be careful just because, like, when you're exiting, this is the same thing that like you can do this on the web too. When you go to close a window and somebody gives you that alert, like, "Hey, are you sure you want to leave?" Um, I'm not positive about that, but if you could do that with a NativeScript app, but I would recommend not doing anything annoying here. Sort of the same thing with resume, suspend. Like these should really be transparent things. Logging of some sorts, analytics are good fits for this.
My favorite, I'm reminded of don't get too complicated or fancy in some places. I'm reminded of watching, teams build their websites and then put a bunch of logic in their error pages. So, and then the error pages having errors and they end up in this like endless loop. And it's like at some point you just need to use HTML because you're not quite sure what the problem is.
Yep. And the same thing here. I mean, if you're using this to sort of debug your apps, you don't want to get too crazy, like just your lightweight debugging. That's really all you want to do.
Yeah. All right, let's move to the page side then. So now these are things that I think that you're going to be in quite a bit. I think you set your app up, once, maybe kind of fiddle with it every couple months. But from a page perspective, you're definitely going to be in these. And then so here we have loaded, navigated to, navigating to, navigated to, navigating from, navigated from, and unloaded. Now that's actually in the wrong order. I believe navigating to happens before loaded.
Even though you included the asterisk that said it was in order.
I'm pretty sure if we look really closely that this slide is totally correct. We call this live scripting. That's live scripting right there.
Because the navigated ones aren't confusing enough. Like you wouldn't mix those up in any way.
Yes, and these aren't always guaranteed to fire. So unloaded isn't really your choice. Like somebody else gets to make the choice of when unloaded happens. So it might not happen after navigated from as you expect. It might happen minutes later or even seconds later. But all right, so how do we use these? Pretty much the same way, although we do need to do some configuration with them. So if we're writing our visual tree in XML, I'll assume for most cases that everybody is and they're not building it just with raw JavaScript. We've got our page, and then our page element, like right at the top, we're going to define what events they're getting loaded to, or what they're getting wired to. So in this case, the loaded event, we have pointed to load, unloaded is pointed to unloaded, and so on. And then if we look at our pages or our views code, you can see that we're exporting the function that's getting wired to.
Yep, and this is really CommonJS in action, and I think we talked about CommonJS a little bit last time. But if you're unfamiliar with CommonJS, it's the spec that Node.js follows, and a lot of JavaScript libraries follows as well. And really, all there are two keywords. There's require, which we saw earlier to sort of bring in modules, and the exports keyword. And the exports keyword is what you use to actually say, my module exposes this function or this property for other modules to use. So in this case, all you're saying in your JavaScript here is I want to expose the load function, which is where that exports keyword comes in. And that's what the XML, that's what's making it available for the XML to use. So anything you export in your JavaScript file that is tied to the view, the XML can subscribe to. And that's what is being used to make the tie.
Yeah. So let's look at this. Let's get out of this slide business here. So we're not going to show the demo code in just meme. What we did was we went off and created a simple little app that I'm going to bring in focus here. And this simple app has kind of just a raw code. We wanted to make sure we were just talking about the concepts and keeping it pretty raw. So let's talk about eventing first. Or actually, let's talk about the app. let's just start from the top. So we talked about, I think the example was on exit, right? And we used, we killed some analytics. Here you see I'm in the app.js file. I've wired up, I've loaded my application module. I've got here on launch, on suspend, on exit, on caught error. I've got in the case of on launch and uncaught error, I get an argument that I can do something with. And then that's it. I'm just shelling out to the console. So nothing too fancy there. And then I also, just for giggles, added some global variables to see kind of where they would go and how you would use them. And in this case, I'm adding the who's awesome variable, and it turns out that apparently it's you.
Yeah, I add the same variable to all my apps actually too.
Do you?
Yeah,
that's pretty nice. It's pretty nice. Moving on, let's talk about events then. So, in the same way, here is a page, right? And we've got all of our events there, kind of wired up, loaded, navigating to, so on. And then in the background, we're exporting each one of those things to a function. And you can see that they all come down here, and I've got this little set log message, and here we're pumping out a little message on the screen. So if I come back to the app, and I think this puppy is already running, so you can see the console. So if I hit events, you're going to see I got navigating to loaded and navigated to. And I know this is pretty stellar demoware here, but then on the way back out, unloaded, navigated from. Oh, it actually unloaded. See, we did. And out of an order I wasn't expecting, actually.
Had to update the slide.
Or the console statement wrote.
Yeah, the idea here, though, is, I mean, this example is purposely simple just so you can see the idea of how to connect this. See how the exports keyword is used again, just to tie these things into the XML so this runs. So in this case, it's not really doing anything all that interesting per se, but you would use this as a tie to do any logic you need when your page loads. So in just meme as an example, this would be our hook to actually go load images, go off to our HTTP API to go get images, grab images from the device. Depending on your app, you might do any number of things when the actual page loads.
Yeah, I find myself using loaded, navigated to, and then navigating from quite a bit. So loaded, I kind of, that's, your hook to just get things set up. Navigated to is like, all right, I'm here, make sure I've got my hook calls going, whatever.
Yeah, navigated to is usually for context. So when one page needs to pass one another. Yep. So navigated to gets used a lot for like master detail type views.
Yep.
Like I have my master with a list view, and then I need to edit it. So I go into the detail, and I use navigated to as a means of passing the users dealing with object X or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, so you mentioned context there. So if I look at the main page here, here we've got a bunch of buttons. You saw that's this screen right here. This is the main or home. And so I've got some buttons, and if I look at the buttons here, I'm passing hello as the context on each one of these. So I'm doing that navigation that we talked about, grabbing that frame, and then passing the context. And then, as you said, navigated to, here I'm grabbing that navigation context, and this here would equal hello.
Yeah, so the full flow while you're logging that out is you start an app.js. That's the first thing NativeScript calls in your app that you actually get to do something in, and that's where we have the application events handled and such. App.js, all you're doing in there is basically configuring those events and saying what's the first page. So you don't have to navigate to the first page, NativeScript just gives you a variable that says, what's your first page? And in this, it's the home view page that Clark was just showing a minute ago. In this simple app, the home view page is just basically a bunch of links to some of these other concepts. It's the page that's showing right there with the 4 bluish buttons standing there. And each of those has these navigate statements associated with them or exported from them to take off to these other views that you may see in the folders there to the side. In this case, the events one, the top link there.
And there you go. There's the context right there.
So it's an example of how you'd pass data through. And as we said, in a more realish app, you'd probably pass like master detail and object. We use this in just meme to pass the image source, as the slide showed earlier. We'd say the context is the image, pass it to the detail, use navigated 2 to actually take that image and do whatever it is we need to do with it.
Yeah. I mean, it worked out really well. Like it was nice to fling that stuff around.
Yep.
All right, let's jump back.
So we've got our app. We can now move around. We've got multiple views. We're not stuck with one view. We're moving around.
Yep.
We got some events, so we have some hooks to actually do something.
Right.
There.
Yeah. So at this point, we have the structure, if you will, the plumbing. I think the president's calling me right now.
Yeah, that's all right. This is more important.
Oh, it's totally more important.
Yeah, we have layouts to talk about.
We do, and so let's talk about layout. And I'm not going to read this, but I do want to highlight the fact that one, it's an intensive process, right? So you need to make sure that you're being respectful of the layout mechanism. Boy, the president didn't even want to leave me a message. So you need to be respectful of the process and understand that it has to go through these passes to figure out sizing and how many images are there and when those things happen, and then lay out the screen. So you can be very destructive in your layout process and destroy yourself, right? So you need to be careful, but at the same time, it's still a tool to help you not make ugly things.
Yep, and this is what I find particularly interesting about layouting is, remember that we're talking about Android and iOS here. So each of these are ecosystems that have their own mechanisms or systems for handling these. So it's kind of cool that NativeScript makes this possible, because Android in particular has a sort of nasty way of dealing with layouts and this messy structure. So it's kind of cool that there are even abstracted syntaxes at all that let you do this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yes. So let's look at some of the layouts. There are 5 of them, and they are the backbone of your view, if you will. So we have an absolute, a dock, a grid, a stack, and a wrap, and they are pretty self-explanatory. But let's kind of go through each one and talk about them. So absolute layout, this is you have the control that you want here's the rope, go hang yourself, if you will.
Yeah.
You set the pixel where you want it, X, Y coordinates. If you want to overlap them, have at it. So here you can see we're creating a new absolute layout. And then we're going to start setting the width and then adding things to the layout itself. So set the left with this label, set the top with that label. Now, this code does not match that up there, but pretty simplistic. What's that?
The code doesn't even match.
No, it wasn't going to match. There's too much code to try to make that pretty picture. So
yeah. That picture would be basically a red 100 by 100 red box. That's.
I just didn't seem like it was worth the time. Everybody gets it. That president just called and said they got it. Doc. Now we've tried to use this a few times, and then we're told we were doing our layout wrong. But this is, I like to think of it as just snapping around, if you will, kind of like the screen snaps on your either Windows or OS X. But here you see we have a dock layout. We're going to put our buttons inside the dock, and then we're going to tell them I want the dock. I want this button on the left, the top, the right. Fill it should be the remainder.
Yeah, and these are things too. These layouts, you can nest them as well. So you can say, I want to absolutely lay these out in such an area, and then I want to dock something within that, and all sorts of other combinations that we're looking at. So you can do that, and that gives you a lot of flexibility. But you also want to be careful too, kind of back to Clark's earlier point, that layout can be an intensive process. And so the more complexity you add to this, the more work NativeScript's going to have to do to try to respect that sort of the sort of hierarchy that you're building. So with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Oh, that's a much better way of saying, here's a rope, go hang yourself.
Yes.
So the next three layouts are ones that I have used, and I think you as well have used in every single, maybe all together in one view.
Yeah, you should have started.
Certainly. Well, let's knock out the boring ones first. So a grid layout, and again, the picture does not match the code. A grid layout is just that. It's a grid. You define your columns, your rows. You define how greedy or not greedy they will be in the relative space that they have of their parent. And here you see we got a button. We're assigning it a column of 0, column of 1, column of 2. Here's a row 1. Now this would be assumed column 0 if it's not defined. And then we're spanning it. So this actually would be this box right here. So pretty simple. You can have grids within grids. You said you can have any layout within a layout.
Yeah, I find grid layout I use the absolute most, just because it tends to be the most elegant way to describe a page. These are my UI elements on the page. Here's where things are going to be, and you have quite a bit of control over this.
Yeah, yes, I agree. The next common stack layout, you can stack them either horizontally or vertically, and it's pretty simple, right? It's a one element. Define its orientation. Horizontal is the default, and then just start adding elements to it, and away it goes. One thing to note, though, if you stack too many things, you may want to wrap your stack layout in a scroll view such that you can get to the rest of them. And we'll show that as well, too.
Yep, scroll view just being another XML element that basically lets you go beyond the height of your screen. Because by default, NativeScript's going to limit you. It's not going to let you actually scroll. So you got to be careful about how much stuff you throw in and throw on the screen or throw in a stack.
Yeah. And then a wrap layout, as it is, it will dynamically lay out the children and the columns and just wrap it all the way down. Now, this is what we used in JustMeme. I think JustMeme was probably a grid, a wrap inside of a grid. Well, certainly a wrap inside of a tab view. But in that case, right, we were throwing images in, and as we threw the images in, it would figure out positionally where they should be. And even when you turn it, right, turn a tablet or a phone, it will relay those back out and rerun that to the width and height that it has available.
Yeah, and it worked out well for us because the images were of unknown widths. So if you remember from the JustMeme screenshot, we were controlling the height. So everything had a static height, but the width could be tiny or big depending on what the resolution of the user's device is. And people have all sorts of different cameras, and it's cross-platform iOS and Android. So these things can vary quite a bit. And so what wrap layout does is let us not worry about it. And when things aren't going to fit, NativeScript automatically determines when to drop them down for us.
Yeah, it worked out really well. It was really fantastic. So that's the wrap layout. There's some resources, but let's look at this stuff in action. So I had some fun with this. Let's look at the code. Let's look at the app first. So here's a blank page, and we're gonna kind of go in and out of this example here because we're gonna start talking about modules, and this ties into the module stuff as well because we needed modules to add to our layouts. But we can add some controls. Here I added a whole bunch. I can make it landscape, and you'll see that it's readjusted. I'm 4 wide now, and I'm probably, 7 wide now. So the wrap layout's taking care of that. You can see here, in this case, we just have a wrap layout. It's empty. I'll leave how we added controls to it later. We've defined the height. We could make this 100. We said we want it center aligned. And while that thing is off building, this will reshape my boxes, my pretty little boxes.
Yeah, notice the scroll view too, which is on lines 8 and 11, is what is making these things actually able to scroll here in the simulator. And there's a similar mechanism on Android that enables the same sort of thing, because otherwise the wrap would just go down beyond the screen and you just wouldn't be able to access the bottom numbers.
Yep. And you see here as I add more, it just continues to scroll indefinitely. And yeah, I mean, really nice, right? I simply changed that to from 10 to 50, and I got a whole new layout. I didn't even do anything to it. Here I just changed it back down, and it's gonna rebuild here.
So the question becomes, then how are you adding things to this wrap layout? Because it looks empty to me.
It is empty. So let's talk about controls. Where did my lovely browser window go? All right. TJ, is it modules or widgets?
I don't know. Both.
Is it both?
Your slide says so it must be true.
Well, I could change it really quickly. I could put a strike through this.
Well, they are modules. So sort of as this slide is showing, last time we talked a bit about NativeScript modules, and we've looked at a couple of these today. So things like the application module that is showing on this slide, or even the camera module, or just really any JavaScript common JS module that you use in a NativeScript app. And NativeScript provides a whole slew of these, which are in the TNS modules folder in your NativeScript app, just showing up in red in the slide here. And Clark will go in here and show you that it lives within your app folder. So all of these things that live in here. And one thing kind of cool is that all of these UI controls that we've been seeing, so things like scroll view, wrap layout, page, all of these things are actually also NativeScript modules that you can dig in your app and find them and look at how they work, dig into the source, find how they're actually, how the magic is happening on the native side, the Android and iOS side.
Yeah, so typically a widget is a UI element, even though it's a module. So you'll hear widget used in some places in a documentation, but it is in fact a module. They're structured the same, like you said. And these things live in that TNS modules folder, at least the out-of-the-box ones do, because you can write your own, or you can get some off NPM like the ones you've written. And all of them follow a convention. There should be a packages.js file in here too, right?
You got a package.json file. You just forgot to put it in. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's in your picture.
There. Real time. Live scripting. We're live scripting.
.json, not .js.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is brother. So each one of these follows convention, right? We have the name of the module .platform.javascript or JS. And so we have an iOS, an Android, soon there'll be a Windows, and then there's a common. So obviously the iOS and Android are the implementations for iOS and Android. And then the common is what?
Common is anything you want to share across those platforms. So oftentimes, like let's say you're building an activity indicator. Well, in your Android and iOS files, you're going to have to actually tie into the native controls that are needed to build that activity indicator. But there's quite likely some logic that you're going to want to share across those implementations. Maybe you have a function that determines how fast the indicator spins or how long it goes, and it isn't specific to one OS, then it would be put in the common file. But the cool thing here is that you don't have to worry about any of that for the NativeScript provided modules because all that work is really done. So all you have to do in this case is just use the XML element or use its JavaScript API, which I think we're going to get into here in a minute. And the nitty-gritty details of how these are implemented is just something you have to worry about if you want to dig into the source, which the source is actually quite readable, or if you want to build some of these things, some of these custom elements for yourself.
Yeah. So what do we have? Well, we have a lot. You mentioned activity indicator, so you don't need to go build one of those. It's there. It's not to say that there's not things that need to be built, but there is quite a bit there. Certainly enough there to get you started. And one question we get a lot is, oh, great, here's yet another abstraction that I have to deal with. How do you feel about that?
About more abstractions?
Yeah.
I don't know. NativeScript gives you, I don't know. The thing I like about NativeScript is that you can always step outside the abstraction. If you want to. You can always get at the nitty-gritty if you need to.
Yeah, I think that's the important point. Is so while you have a button, and let's say a button, the abstraction can do, I don't know, let's say it does 75% of the things across both platforms. You can still go add the rest of the stuff, right? It's JavaScript. You can still change the behavior if you want to, and it's there for you to use. So
yeah, and I could give a specific example. There is a list view in NativeScript. So build a giant list of things, a pretty common thing to use in an app. And in an app I was working on with a colleague of mine, Jen Looper, we needed to delete from the list. And that's not something that's currently in the modules because there's no real cross-platform way to do delete. iOS has the sort of swipe to delete, and Android doesn't necessarily have a native built-in mechanism. There's like a press, there's like a hold to delete that you can kind of do on Android, but I don't know how intuitive that is. And so what we did is we just build a little layer on top of the list view. So we implemented swipe to delete on iOS, and for Android what we did is we actually just tossed in some little trash can icons into the template and just used that to delete from the list. And it worked out quite well. So these abstractions are there for the sort of the common things. Like there's things that we didn't have to build ourselves, like actually build the list, make it scroll, add the events, all these sorts of things. But then when we needed some custom logic, we were able to add it.
Yeah. And we'll actually getting into some native API calls here too. So
yep, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here.
Yeah, are you? So what do we got here? This is us using a control, and now we've somewhat seen this already because we looked at the layout stuff. But on the left-hand side, we're just gonna use it because it's in our default namespace already. It's going to appear. If you had written your own custom module, then you've got your own namespace that you're going to have to import. So here we got a stack layout. We're adding some labels to that stack layout. Have at it. They're just going to work. If I wanted to do it programmatically, so on the right-hand side, view.js, I add in my UI WAC label, my module. Once I have my module, I create an instance of it, and then I can set whatever properties I want to set on it. Now, of course, in this case, that doesn't do me any good unless I add it to the view or add it to the layout itself. So I would have to also get the layout and add that child element to that layout. So,
yeah, and I'd say most of the time, the vast majority of the time, you tend to stick in the XML just because you tend to just lay things out that way, and you don't need to dynamically change things, which is what the JavaScript syntax is really for. But there are certainly cases, and to kind of segue back in our example in a minute, it's kind of how the wrap layout example with the red boxes was working under the hood.
And it's exactly what we had to do for Just Meme, right? We did not know how many images we would have from the cloud, and thus we needed to dynamically build the visual tree, or part of the visual tree, not the entire thing, but part of the visual tree when we got it.
Yep.
So how did we go about doing some of that? Well, in this case, here we've got the labels defined up above. And then down below, we are getting, you can see here, we're going and querying our page for that element. Now, in this case, I've given it an ID that you can see here, label ID, oh, get me please. And so page get view by ID, oh, get me please. I get an instance to my label, and then I can set some values on that control.
Yep, and you can assign an ID to basically anything, any UI component or any widget in NativeScript. So you could put it on the stack layout and use it to get a reference to that. I believe you can put it on the page, although I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. But basically anything you put in your XML can have an ID, and you can use it to get a reference to it in your JavaScript and do whatever.
Whatever you want. And then, of course, you can still go native and get things, and we're going to show this as well. But in this case, we are grabbing the frame module, and we're getting the frame, and we're going to mess around with the nav bar. I'm going to change some colors, and here we're just calling native APIs. I know we're not really going to talk about the interface into the native side all that much today. We'll save some of this for the next time. But you can see here, once we have the controller, we're just going to start. What's going on with my mouse here? We're just going to start getting and using the iOS APIs. So in this case, UI color, we're getting the RGBA set. We're setting the default now 0. In this case, happens to be the default bar style, but I'm just showing it. Changing the tint color of it. We're changing the title attributes, and those are all iOS APIs. So
yeah, and the key here too is if you know at the very first line, the sort of sniff, the check to make sure you're on iOS, and so your NativeScript app is cross-platform. So this code will run on Android. It'll just skip over basically all of this, and so this is just one way that you can sort of configure your app specifically for one OS. I mean, this is doing some visual changes for iOS that just won't affect Android at all. And you could do the same sort of thing with Android as well. Just tie into the appropriate APIs to do so.
Yeah, and I want to show. I had kind of an aha moment with NativeScript when you showed me these, or when I saw them. And so part of NativeScript, when you do the build, it builds that manifest, right? And I think we talked about this a little bit the last time. And you know, the iOS APIs can be verbose. And if you're not in them every day, you might not necessarily know how they work or whatnot. But here I've browsed to this the TypeScript definition of what's been exported from the core runtime from iOS, and you can see here all of the method calls, and somewhere in here will be UI color, right? Yep, here's UI color. And there's the colors that were set and all that. So it's a nice little reference to see what the APIs, how you would expect them in JavaScript, I guess.
Yeah, and also, I mean, these are TypeScript definition files. So if you are the type of person that likes to use TypeScript, I mean, you can bring in these definition files and get code complete and basically validation of your code for accessing these iOS and Android APIs. So you could type UI color dot and do your little autocomplete or IntelliSense and see what APIs are available, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, that is powerful. Yeah, and here's the Android one.
Yeah, Android goes off to the right because everything in Android is under either a Android or Java sort of top level namespace.
Everything goes to the right. All right, so let's look at some code. That's the. So let's go back to the layout because that's where we were dynamically loading some stuff. So here's the wrap layout, right? It was empty. You alluded to the trickery that was going on. So
where's our entry point here in the XML? Where's our tie? How do we?
That's a good point. So here we call load, and then in our menu item, and we didn't talk about this control, but let's pull this back open. So layouts and controls. So page.options menu. This add controls, this menu item add controls, is this up here in our menu bar, nav bar, whatever you want to call it. And when I click on this, here we've bound to a function called create controls. So if I come back over here, you can see I've exported create controls.
Yep. So there's two events basically going on here: the loaded and create controls.
Yep.
And so it looks like all loaded is doing is essentially saving off a reference to the page so that this create controls can use it, and also setting that title up there as well. And you should really have an if iOS checker on that title there.
I should, but I didn't want to do it just to make you mad, so I could add more goofy comments in GitHub.
Okay. Yes. So I'll have to change that later. You're also using 2 spaces for tabs, which also annoys me as well. But we'll take that up another time.
We could take that up another time. So create controls.
To bring us back on topic.
Back on topic. Create controls. Here again, page, get view by ID, my wrap layout. We talked about this in the slides. And then what I'm going to do is just a simple little loop. And then I'm going to call create controls. And I'm going to pass it the container and the counter, if you will, whatever position I am in that loop. Now, one of the things that excites me about kind of this whole native and then JavaScript all kind of mixed together is you get to use JavaScript as it's meant to be used, right? So in this case, I'm using closures, right? And I'm calling create controls, passing it some stuff. And down here is where I'm going to create a label. I'm going to take the number. So this is going to, in this case, it's going to be I, whatever I was. Assign a width to the label. And then I'm going to create a border, give it a radius, set some stuff on the border, and then I'm going to shove the label inside the border. Now I'm using these controls intentionally because they're controls that don't have inherent behaviors, right? So you could set border color and its size and things like that, but a border doesn't have a tab, right? It's not like a button. But in our case, if I come back here and I add some controls and I click on one, I'm going to get a dialog box and it's going to tell me the counter number of the thing that was clicked on, right? So now we have this context going from when it got created to when somebody did action on it. And so closures gets us passing the context of I around. And I've got a label, I've created a label, I've shoved it in a border, I've got some properties on it, but the border doesn't have a tab. So one of the things that you can do is add gestures to it. And in this case, what I'm doing is I'm telling the border to observe this gesture. So in this case, it's the tap. And when tap happens, I'm calling a function. Now I could have put the callback in here, but I put it down below for speaking sake. And we're going to pass that counter along again. We're going to create some options. I'm using yet another module called the dialogues module. We're going to set the properties of that window. So we said use selected and then selected 17. So use selected, the message was selected plus I, and then OK. And when OK fires, there's a promise that comes back, and then it logs it. And if I bring back over in here, you'll see here that the console is in that promise, and it logs. In this case, it logs 17.
I think you nailed it too, and you just said that. I mean, this is, even though there's some unfamiliar concepts here that we've been kind of going over, there's a lot that if you've done anything with JavaScript before, that you'll easily recognize. Like if you already know how to do a for loop, you know how to do a for loop. I can tell you it's like hell in Objective-C just trying to do something simple as a for loop. Even if you go down to the bottom there where the dialog is, you'll see that alert there returns a promise. So it's the same promises spec that's now coming to the browser, and that there's a number of libraries that implement as well. So it's a familiar syntax. Attach a function that after the alert is, in this case, this shows like the OK button, right? So after the alert is dismissed.
Yeah, and here this is the same kind of pattern that we use in Just Meme to create that wrap layout to get those images. In this case, we're just not calling any HTTP things. We're just creating borders and labels. In that case, we were creating images. Images still didn't have any inherent like taps or gestures on it, and such. We added these gestures to that element, added some callbacks to it, used some closures along the way, and bam, we got this context kind of front and back, and we simplistically were able to do what we needed to do.
Yep, and if you go through the hands-on lab for this month as well, you'll go through the same basic thing. You'll create a wrap layout, you'll add images, much like the way this example is running, and then you'll also tie a function when those images are actually clicked.
Yeah. Let's look at the native call, because we talked about that some too. So if I come back to the app and I click on the native call, you're going to see here, I get a nice green native bar, and you'll have to look really close, but this is actually dark gray. It's very trendy, hipster, dark gray. Unfortunately, I've also hid the back button, so I have to kill the app to actually get back. But point being, here, when our loaded got called, we grabbed the app in the frame. We checked to make sure that we're in iOS.
Hey, you checked that time.
Yeah. It was just that other one I was being lazy. I mean, the other one I was trying to make you mad. And then we're calling the native controls. And so UI color, black color. There's the dark gray for the textile attributes. And somewhere in here, I am hiding navigation item set hides back button animated. So we are hiding the back button. Should be able to say false here. Rebuild that. If show up.
If you're an iOS people either think that the iOS APIs are either verbose if you don't like iOS, or very descriptive, I guess, if you're trying to defend the APIs. So I love APIs like color with red, green, blue, alpha.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like really. Yes. We didn't know what RGBA was.
Yeah. Or just color, and
my NodeMon stopped.
No.
There we go. So what I have running while this is building, what I have is NodeMon running, and you and I run a little bit differently. You have a save command inside of Sublime. I'm using Atom in this case. And I have NodeMon watching JavaScript files, CSS files, XML files, and anytime it changes, it just goes out, re-prepares, re-emulates, and then shoves this stuff out there. Yeah, so now I got my back button back. So there's some iOS calls. All right.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll mention there too is I think for most apps you don't frequently have to do this sort of thing where you have to dig into the native code. And it's more that when you need to go jump off the rails, do something very custom, that you have access to do it. And this is the sort of thing too that if you're doing this in a NativeScript app, you can log this as a feature request. NativeScript is open source. GitHub.com/NativeScript/NativeScript. If you go there, if you find like, oh, I need to do this on Android and NativeScript doesn't make it possible out of the box, then by all means request it. It's something that we can incorporate into the core modules, because chances are if you need to do it, that other people need to do it as well.
Yep. Or build it yourself and share.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you NativeScript plugins, starting to see a few of those pop up, and we'd love to have more of them out there.
So next is data binding. And this for me is, I don't know, just black magic. But data binding is the process of connecting the UI to some piece of data, right? And while it's defined this way, for me, I just define it as black magic, because when it works, it works. When it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And only people who know how to do magic write this stuff. I am not talented enough to make any type of black magic like this. And I usually end up feeling like this, you know, just like, it's either like, oh, it doesn't work, or it works. Either way, it's the same reaction. Inside of NativeScript, it is, I call them mustaches, but 2 mustaches on one side, 2 mustaches on the other, and then a reference to the object, or the placeholder in the object, if you will. So that assumes that there's something's been set on the page that it can then get at, right? So in this case, label, the text is going to be bound to N. So let's dig into that a little bit more. On the left side, we still have the XML for the view. On the right side, we have the JavaScript behind it. We're going to pull in the observable module. I'm going to create a new observable, call it view data. In the load, I'm going to set N. So I'm going to call view data.set, because view data is in fact an observable object, not, it's an object, it's the observable object. I don't know how else to explain it. We're going to set N, which will be a new property on that observable object, and we're going to give it the text of awesome. That's all fine and dandy. That's just setting that thing on that view data object. But we need to bind that object to the binding context of the page. So page.binding context. And then, well, in this case, it's page, or I've called it page. And then we're going to take that object and set it to the binding context, so that when I'm over here and it has visibility to N. Did I do a terrible job of trying to explain it, black magic?
No, I think it works. I mean, if you've done any sort of front-end development with an MVC framework, and other technology stacks have this concept as well, it's just sort of an MVC approach. I mean, really, all your observable is just an object that you can get and set things on. And the sort of high-level way I like to think of it is just that anything you set on that binding context, or your observable, you can access with the mustache syntax. So if you set N, you can get at it. The other part of it too is that if you then update N, like you need to run some logic in your app to manipulate that somehow, and you set it again, that the UI will automatically detect that change and update for you.
Yes, so by default, it's a 2-way binding.
Yep.
All right, let's take it a step further. So I have the ability to do some expressions. So if, in this case, let's look at the second one, if author is not, there isn't anything, we can actually set some default text. You can see I've got some if-then logic, and up above that. You can also have a converter on that, where you can do some kind of manipulation to the thing. So say you have a date and you don't want to show the ticks, you want to convert ticks to an actual readable datetime format, you can do that as well.
Yeah, and it actually, the NativeScript follows Polymer. If you're familiar with the Polymer library and the expression syntax it uses, NativeScript actually uses the exact same syntaxes. So anything that's possible there is something you can do in your NativeScript app as well.
Event binding.
Yeah, so what's happening here is that we looked earlier at how taps could talk to things that were exported from the exported from the page. And in this case, you can also use sort of the mustache syntax to access functions that are defined on the observable.
Yeah, and in this case, we're also showing that when you first click it, you get awesome, and then when the button is clicked, we're changing that to clicked, and so that two-way binding is happening automatically, and we don't have to do any page refreshes or anything.
Yep, and what's cool about that too is remember, like, we're dealing with native UIs here. There is no web view. It's not like we're updating a div here. There are actual native controls that NativeScript is dynamically updating here when you do this.
Yeah, so let's dive into this. So a little bit more of a complicated example, but I think it's relevant and it's worth spending a little bit of time on, and it's the list view. This is something that many people will use. This should be brought over one. Many people will use, many people will ask about. I certainly need them for pretty much everything. So let's look through it. So I got a loaded and navigated to. We've somewhat touched on the list view before, but here's a good example of where we're going to use loaded to create some things and navigated to go get some things. Let's bring the code up real quick just so people get context of what we're doing. So this actually, I run a conference on the side, and in August we're kicking off this conference again, and we've got 150 some odd sessions that are out there. So in the list view, what I wanted was the ability to say, go call some resource that's got a whole bunch of stuff. It's got a big object. In this case, we've got 150 sessions and speakers and everything that's in there. So good item for a list view. You can see here that this, scrolls on its merry way of everything that's there. So how do we get that? So let's start with loaded and navigated to. Loaded, out of the gate, we're going to just create the binding context. So in this case, we've got should be view data, not view model, but view data. We're going to create a new observable object. At the time it's loaded, it's empty. When we navigate to it is when we go and get that data from the magic servers in the cloud. So get sessions happens to be my little wrapper on calling thatconference.com and getting back the list of accepted sessions. And so it returns a promise. So this is using the HTTP module from NativeScript. It returns a promise. I parse that JSON result into a sessions object. So it's a list of, and let's get really geeky here. Let's go over to our favorite. Yeah, let's make it real. Right here is the list that's returned. You can see speakers. This one happens to have 2 speakers. There's a title. There's a description, some category stuff, and this goes on and on and on. So we're going to get that back. We're going to parse it into that sessions object, and then we're going to set the view model. We're going to set this object called sessions to that object. So then when I come back up here, my list view is going to bind to that, and at that point, the list view has everything it needs. Now, from there, we're going to start doing some things. We're going to create a template for the list view to display. So we create this item template. In this case, we're using a grid. So I've set 2 columns, 1 row. So if we look back at this, here's the 2 columns, one with what would be the speaker's image, and then here we have the title and the speaker.
Yep,
right.
And there's only 1 row there because of the stack layout too.
There's only 1 row. Yep.
We'll get there in a minute.
Yeah. Right. So we have 1 row. We have 2 elements in that row, the image on the left and the stack layout on the right.
Yeah.
And so we're setting call 0 for the image, call 1 for the stack layout, and then the stack layout is setting the title and the description, or title and the speaker's name. And you can see here we're binding the title, and here we're binding to the speaker's name. Now in this case, the speaker is a collection of speakers on the session. So we have to say, I'm just saying speaker 0. So take the first speaker, first name, and then I'm using the expression to also grab their last name, put a space in the middle, and out we get that.
I was just I was confused at first because it's like one row. I clearly see 2 lines of text here, but I forgot this is just another example of nesting layouts.
Yep.
The stack layout is in the one row, and it just shows 2 labels within it.
Yeah. Yeah, this example kind of ties everything that we've been talking about for the last hour together, right? We've used our events, our page events, to get some stuff. We've created a number of controls and layouts. We're doing some binding. We've used our modules. Now in this case, we're not dynamically creating any elements because the list view, in fact, is doing that for us. But
yep. And the cool thing about the data binding approach, and I think why it's so powerful over just doing everything in JavaScript, is notice here how in this JavaScript code, there's nothing about the UI here. The JavaScript logic is just saying, go get some sessions and then just set them on this object. And that's it. Like it doesn't have to tell, like, go build a list or go update the UI. There's none of that. All you do is just say, oh, I got to set the sessions. And you just let NativeScript take it from there.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool from a decoupling perspective. Just your JavaScript code doesn't need to know about the UI specifically. All it's doing is interacting with the observable or the sort of view model here that acts as a bridge between the two.
Yeah, and if we do it fast enough, I don't know. Now it's probably pre-cached already, but if I do it fast enough, it's going to load it as it comes in the place. I can't get to it fast enough, so it doesn't matter. And you could see I could click on this item in the list view and get taken to the detail page, but I didn't take it that far. So
yeah, eventually probably just build on top of this. Just use what we talked about earlier. Handle taps.
Yep.
Do navigate to another view. Include some context so the next view knows what to display.
Yeah,
would be the next logical steps here.
I didn't try rotating it. It should just, there you go. For those who are landscape people.
So to segue in the last part, how can I make that list view look different?
You hire a designer.
Oh, that's right. I forgot.
Yeah. And this is where class ends, people. So let's talk about CSS. Yeah, it is finally cool to wear an Apple Watch. So CSS is how we can style things outside of just setting things ourselves. Like we showed the border example where we were setting the radius and that on the object itself. CSS is there for us to use. Asterisk, it is only a subset of CSS.
Yeah, and the reason this comes up, this sort of question about this comes up like, well, why is it only a subset? And it's important to remember that these again are native apps, native iOS and Android apps, and some of the rules that some of the things you can do in the browser just don't really translate over into a native concept. And also, I mean, some of them it would be possible to make work, but there are performance implications for doing it. Remember how we talked about earlier how layout it can potentially be resource intensive. So what the NativeScript team we do is we look at each of these things and say like, well, if it's going to impose a certain performance or technical limitation here, then those are why not all of these rules are really available.
Yeah, and I think the semantic piece is important. It's the same reason we don't have HTML as the visual tree, as semantically it just doesn't make sense in a native place. But in CSS, it kind of follows both sides of that.
Yep.
3 different levels we can apply CSS: at the application level, at the page level, and then inline. So like you would expect, they cascade down and overwrite one another. There is a bit of a bit of magic that happens if you name it the same, just like you did with the JavaScript. If you name, in this case, create template.css, it will automatically get loaded. You don't have to do anything on that page to make reference to that. You can support selectors. I never know really how far to go with CSS. I kind of assume people know how to do it. Like it works, it's standard CSS. Say reference the CSS page on nativescript.org that shows what's supported and not supported. But
yeah, if you know CSS, you're going to recognize the semantics. Sort of you include a selector, and then you include a series of property key value pairs in order to configure things. And so this is the data binding example and the syntax associated with it. So you
yep,
can see probably the easiest one to look at is image. Images have a width of 50, and so
yep.
that's why they're kind of small over there on the side. The grids
Se-
have some padding, so they're not right up against. So your elements aren't right up against those lines on the list view. The session
section
titles are
titles blue.
yeah.
What you would expect.
Yep. And I mean, as Clark said, this is a great thing to just look at the docs, to look over a list. There's a pretty well documented list of what properties are out there. And some new ones are coming for 1.2. I just saw that border just landed in the modules, and some of the background properties, like you can now do background repeat as well.
Nice.
So that just landed in 1.2. So it's the sort of thing that if there is a property that is not listed but you have really good use cases for, by all means submit a feature request on our GitHub repo and ask for it, and we can see what we can do.
Yeah, I'd say lastly, the only thing to be aware of is when you do want to assign a CSS class, the attribute CSS class, and then from your CSS you reference it like you would reference any other class. ID would be the same as well, except ID is just ID.
Yep.
So that's CSS. Where does that leave us?
I think we're at the end of the list here.
Yeah, we sucked in a whole lot. So things we didn't talk about. Now we still have another session that we're going to go. We're going to dive into some deeper topics, but for purposes of today, things we didn't talk about. Dealing with screen sizes. There's a great section on nativescript.org that talks about pixel densities and landscape and portrait and how to add those things onto your application. We did briefly touch on application settings. I should say we briefly touched on kind of global application settings, but there's again another page on application settings. Custom events on controls, weak events, we did not talk about, so make sure to check that out. We did show a dialogue and a gesture, but we just kind of touched on them. And then one thing I haven't used, which is placeholder. I don't know if you've used it yet.
Yeah, this actually come up. We've been working on, and you could find this on GitHub, a Google Maps plugin for NativeScript. And the placeholder is what you use to bring in some essentially third-party native elements. And so with Google Maps, the placeholder is used as actually the point that the map actually goes in. So in your XML, you put a placeholder in, you configure it, you tie it to a JavaScript event, and you can use Google Maps on your iOS and Android apps.
Yeah, so kind of a way to put a placeholder in your visual tree if I'm using the words. So.
I like to think of it as the div of NativeScript.
Let's strike that. Let's not do that. Now there's going to be placeholders everywhere. Again, remember, nativescript.org is the place for everything. I'd also say, look at the TNS modules. I find myself looking at both quite often. Some because sometimes the modules just because they're right there and easy.
Yep, and if you have any feedback, especially related to this session or related to the Summer of NativeScript material, feel free to submit that stuff. We have a GitHub repo that's linked to on the nativescript.org/summer site. Any requests you'd like to see for the third segment of that, we're putting that together now. Just let us know.
Yeah, and we will put this code up. In fact, it's already up in the GitHub repo, so you can see the demo code. But to kind of close out, anything else? I mean, we went through a lot. We talked about some UI stuff. I know, the majority of people probably aren't UI people. I certainly didn't grow up that way. I've been doing a lot of it, as of the last few years. But I would say it's not scary. It's like anything else.
No, there's the same paradigms in NativeScript that you'd expect in other in sort of other technology stacks. But I think the cool thing is that doing it in this cross-platform way buys you a lot of time versus having to learn these mechanisms separately in iOS and Android. And at the end of the day, you have a native app, so there's no web view. I mean, you have a truly native app. And you've saved the time of learning those stacks and how those things that you don't really want to know how they work on those different ecosystems.
Yeah.
I certainly don't want to know how to make an HTTP call on iOS. I have no desire to learn that whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a little mind bending when you get your head around the fact that a button is, two different things, in the end. It's pretty cool.
Yep. But I think that's it.
All right, sir. Well, with that, enjoy your summer, and we will be natively scripting here.
Yes.
And getting ready for our next time together.
We've got one more month, so we will see you next month.
All righty. Thanks, everybody.
All right.